morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Asia Society Policy Institute, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's really our pleasure to host an event on the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC. And this event is co-hosted by the National Center of APEC, which is led by Monica Whaley. Before we go into the program, I just wanted to give some context on why we think APEC is so important, particularly this year with the United States hosting APEC. The head of the IMF has warned that during this year, it's going to be a tough year ahead with a third of the global economy possibly in recession. And when you add to that rising energy prices, rising food prices, growing income inequality, geopolitical tensions, and increasing protectionism, there are a lot of challenges facing the global economy. And what that means is that the need and the desire for international collaboration is really important to address these challenges. And in that regard, APEC will play an important role. As a regional organization, APEC was established in 1989. It was elevated to the leader level in 1993. So that's 30 years ago. And at that point, the United States, President Bill Clinton hosted the first APEC Leaders Summit in Blake Island, Washington. I think, Monica, you were working on ASN, so maybe you'll have some stories to share. And then we also chaired under President Obama's tenure in 2011, when I had the opportunity, when I was with the government, to lead the trade and investment portfolio. And in that, I had a lot of firsthand experience about the importance of APEC, and in particular, the importance of the U.S. hosting APEC. By hosting, it provides the United States an important opportunity to shape the agenda. Which issues do we want to push during the APEC year in collaboration with the other 20 economies? And it also is an important venue for the United States to showcase its economy and really to underscore its commitment and ties with the largest and most dynamic region of the world. The U.S. theme for 2023 is creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. That sounds pretty positive. And Matt Murray, we'll get to in a minute. He'll explain to us what that means in practical terms. And that's always the challenge for the United States team, to take these kind of high themes and to translate them into really practical and meaningful outcomes. While the November leaders meeting to be held in San Francisco and chaired by President Biden will get a lot of the attention during our APEC year, there are a lot of other meetings that will go on all around the country in the lead up to that November meeting, and we'll discuss some of those meetings. And all of this will occur in conjunction with the other big U.S. government initiative in the Indo-Pacific, and that's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And so we'll touch upon how APEC and IPEF, hopefully how they intersect and how, whether there are synergies and what type of synergies between these two initiatives. So we have a great panel of speakers to discuss these questions. First to my right is Matt Murray. He's the U.S. senior official for APEC. He's responsible for coordinating our participation in APEC. He looks pretty calm now, but I think as November comes, you may not be smiling as much. He's had a distinguished career at the State Department. I've had the honor of working with him through his postings, including in Beijing, Canberra, New Delhi, among others. Monica Whaley is president of the National Center of APEC, and she's been with this organization since 2002. And I would just say no one knows APEC better than Monica. When I took over the portfolio in the U.S. government, one of the first people I turned to was Monica to kind of instruct me on the ins and outs and the do's and don'ts. So thank you, Monica, and thanks for co-hosting with us. And then Angie Tang is here. She is head of the communications for the Asia Pacific policy at East West Bank. And her CEO, Dominic Ng, he chairs the U.S. delegation to the APEC Business Advisory Council. And so we look forward to hearing more about what his priorities will be during this year. Angie has also a distinguished career in the government, out of the government, and she also served as chief executive of the Committee of 100. And finally, joining us virtually is Thailand's ambassador to the United States. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador, Tanee Sangrat. And to get the program started, we thought it would be a useful scene setter to learn more about the outcomes of Thailand's host year last year, because one of the objectives of hosts in APEC is to build on the accomplishments of the previous year. And Thailand gets enormous credit for hosting the first in-person APEC meeting in 4 years, if my math is correct, and really pushing an agenda focused on the environment and climate. Prior to his recent posting in Washington, Ambassador Tanee served as a spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Director General of the Information Department. And he's also served as a Thai ambassador to Vietnam, and he's been posted to the United States twice and all around the world. So, Mr. Ambassador, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, Cutler. I want to thank Asia Society and the National Center for APEC for the invitation to speak today. I'm pleased to join you virtually, and I'm pleased to meet all the speakers virtually as well and all the participants today. I'm honored, and it's my pleasure to have a few words with you. APEC was somewhat of a passion for us and for me all the past year and in 2021 as well. 2022 was a year of challenges to be a host of any major gathering, especially APEC, in terms of geopolitical challenges, the supply chain disruptions and economic, and we still had COVID as well. I remember that we started out with the ISAM in Phuket. It was hybrid back then with the Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Kun Thani Thongpakdi at the time. And then we rode right in to the SAM in January in Bangkok. And Thailand has an ambitious theme, as Kun Wendy Cutler had mentioned, under the theme Open, Connect, Balance. And we had achieved some significant outcomes. The most notable leaders' endorsement is the Bangkok goals on BCG economy as the first comprehensive long-term roadmap on sustainability for APEC. The Bangkok goals roadmap on sustainability provides clear pathways to advance sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth in a holistic and ambitious manner, driven through all the APEC's relevant work streams. Along with the Bangkok goals, APEC ministers also welcomed the launch of the APEC BCG Award to recognize BCG champions who can serve as examples for others to learn from and to replicate, I hope. We also launched a dedicated website on the Bangkok goals, bangkokgoals.apec.org, which highlights key APEC initiatives on the BCG and serves as a gateway for further research, especially for the public outside of APEC. The second point I want to share with you is on trade and investment. We initiated a refreshed conversation on the FTAP, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, through a post-COVID lens, focusing on how trade and investment in the next era can address emerging challenges and contribute to sustainable and inclusive growth. Through this process, we delivered a multi-year work plan on the FTAP agenda. It is aimed at building capacity and cooperation among APEC economies in traditional, emerging, and next-generation trade issues such as sustainability, digital trade and e-commerce, trade, and health. Active engagement with the private sector and the empowerment of women, youth, and local communities were also recognized as imperative to facilitating more inclusive trade and investment opportunities. And third, we focused on the resumption of cross-border travel and the strengthening of the region's supply chain resilience and travel protocol. Thailand established and chaired the Apec Safe Passage Task Force, which launched many tangible initiatives. These include, for example, the Apec Safe Passage portal, the sharing of technical specifications of vaccination certificates, and the work towards a more inclusive Apec business travel card, especially for MSMEs who are key growth engines for our region. Fourth, Apec 2022 highly championed sectoral work as well. 8 sectoral ministerial meetings were held, namely on trade, tourism, forestry, health, food security, SMEs, women, and finance. Although no joint ministerial statements were issued, we achieved consensus on many substantive issues, which form an important basis for APEC's future work. And a number of important deliverables were also realized during our host year. For instance, the implementation plan of the APEC Food Security Roadmap, the policy recommendations on regenerative tourism, and the policy considerations for cross-border payments and remittances. And last, it will be remiss not to mention that we also managed to achieve consensus for the AMM joint statement and the leaders' declaration amidst the challenging geopolitical situation and divergent views among members. I hope we remember all of that back in last November. Upon reflection, you'll see that the APEC 2002 started when the world entered the 3rd year of COVID-19. Economic recovery was a matter of utmost urgency, while reopening borders and balancing between health, economy, and the environment were also key drivers. And not long into Thailand's host year, the region further encountered new economic disruptions. In the midst of these challenges, Thailand continued to work with all APEC economies to ensure that APEC stayed on course and that the APEC process continued to move ahead. The achievements made are a testament of all economies' collective belief and efforts to prioritize cooperation that we can advance and prosper together. Now we're looking to APEC 2023. Thailand supports and welcomes the US APEC 2023 theme on creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. And the 3 priorities on interconnected, innovative, and inclusive, we recognize the strong connection and continuation from Thailand's APEC host year and a crucial basis to carry forward the achievements made last year. Under the US leadership in 2023, we look forward to concretely implementing the Bangkok goals through whole of society partnerships and whole of system approach in APEC. We were pleased that this priority was echoed and emphasized by all member economies at the informal summit meeting in Honolulu last month. The business sector through ABAC and NCAPEC here, as well as other relevant institutions like the Asia Society, have crucial roles to play. And we look forward to cooperating and exploring innovative ways you can contribute to the implementation of the Bangkok goals. We also look forward to working closely with the US to start the nomination process for the APEC BCG Award and announcing the first winners at the APEC 23 AMM. Both the Bangkok goals and the BCG Award align with US priorities to address the climate crisis and promote environmental sustainability, which provides important basis to progress these work streams forward this year. On the other pillars, we look forward to advance the implementation of the multi-year work plan on the FTAP agenda. At the same time, we were also pleased that the Safe Passage work will continue through existing mechanisms to promote long-term resilience against future crises and greater business mobility. While APEC 2022 was a very difficult year, and I was on the communication side of things last year, APEC 2023 will certainly face its own challenges as well. But we count on the US able leadership, high capability and commitment to ensure that APEC will continue to provide space for meaningful discussions and incubate further innovative ideas to drive our region forward in a resilient, sustainable, and inclusive manner for all. Thailand will continue to work closely with the US and all APEC member economies, including through the Troika mechanism, to make APEC 2023 a success. And I commit that the Royal Thai Embassy will continue to work closely with all US agencies concerned, including the private sector, to ensure the success of US host year. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and congratulations on your successful APEC year. So now let me turn it over to Matt. Do you think we can match that?
Well, I think to start off, well, first of all, thank you so much to the Asian Society for the invitation. I think when you're a career State Department official, when you get invited to the Asian Society, you feel like you've made the big time. So it's great to be here. Really appreciate that. And I just want to just say thank you to the ambassador for all of the work that his government did put in the last year. It's truly remarkable what Thailand was able to do in 2022 with APEC. When you consider all of the difficulties that he was referring to there, coming out of 2 years worth of virtual meetings only, having to put together the entire logistical framework to host in Thailand. As he said, they started off the host year with the in-person informal senior officials meeting in Phuket. But then by the time the senior officials meeting in Bangkok rolled around in early 2022, they had to go back to virtual again because of the Omicron outbreak. And then in person again in May for the trade ministerial, and then in person the rest of the year. And so to be able to put all of that together, and also then to be able to advance the substance that he just outlined is pretty remarkable. So we do have, I think, in the United States, very big shoes to fill when it comes to what we're able to do as a host in 2023, having to follow Thailand. And I think the one thing that I would definitely pick up on that the ambassador said, and where we are in very strong agreement, is that Thailand's launch of the Bangkok goals for the biocircular green economy is really one of those, I think, very important stepstones, very important achievements that APEC has been able to advance over the last 3 decades. Because I think fundamentally what that does is it really embeds principles of sustainability across all of the various APEC work streams and across all of the different ministerial engagements. And I had worked on APEC more than 10 years ago when we last hosted in 2011, where we did have a green growth agenda, where we did, as under your leadership, talk, advanced environmental goods and services. But I think what Thailand has done now is very comprehensively, very much synced up with the rest of the economies, been able to put sustainability on the map across the board. And so if you haven't read the Bangkok goals, they're 7 paragraphs, just a couple of pages, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. And I think it then dovetails nicely into what we want to do in our host year in 2023. As was said, under a theme of creating a resilient and sustainable future for all, which I think particularly coming out of the COVID pandemic, Secretary Blinken has said, we need to be able to meet this moment that we're in. We are facing a number of economic headwinds. We are facing challenges with supply chain disruptions, with sustainability, with making sure that everyone can fully participate in our economies. And so being able to set up an APEC host year in which we can do that, and as the ambassador said, advance an interconnected, innovative, and inclusive Asia-Pacific region, I think will be hugely important. Just a couple of things, I guess, at the outset, 2 very important points to make. One is, I think this is really an entire interagency effort on the U.S. government side. So we're looking to host 10 ministerials across 4 different locations in 2023. We did host the informal senior officials meeting in Honolulu, and then we'll be in Palm Springs in February for senior officials meetings. In May, we'll be in Detroit, Michigan for both the trade ministerial and a transportation ministerial. And then in August, we'll be back out in Seattle, where we'll have food security, small and medium-sized enterprises, health, women in the economy, energy, and disaster resilience. So 6 ministerials at that cluster of meetings. And then obviously in San Francisco for leaders, for the finance ministerial, and for also the APEC ministerial meeting, that's foreign and trade joint ministerial. So entire interagency effort, we have now already meetings and planning where, there are more than 100 people from across the interagency that are participating. And the second point, which I think is so important because, with Monica and Angie here in particular, is that APEC is really a place where the engagement with the private sector is hugely important, and the engagement with other stakeholders is tremendously important. So, we very much, want to work very closely with the private sector to try to advance these objectives as we go forward. And as the ambassador said, when we're talking about implementing the biocircular green economy, for example, how do we work in tandem with the private sector to do that over the course of our host year? So, there's certainly a big agenda. I hope that I'll be smiling as well throughout the year, but yeah, there's a lot to do, and really looking forward to it.
So can you just explain to the audience what is a ministerial and why are ministerials so important in an APEC year?
Sure. I think, a ministerial meeting would be our, for example, U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador hosting her counterparts from trade ministries from around the APEC region to talk specifically about, the trade priorities for the APEC year. Similarly, Transportation Ministerial will be the Transportation Secretary hosting his counterparts, talk about, what the transportation priorities will be. I think the reason that they're really so important is that they are the building blocks at that very high level, at the ministerial level, that tee up ultimately what's going to happen at the end of the year. I think, as the ambassador said, they also hosted a number of very important sectoral ministerials throughout the year. I think of the food security one and the food security roadmap as being one particularly significant one that they hosted, and also the trade ministerial, where they really worked towards that advancement of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific agenda, which ultimately was highlighted at the leaders meeting at the end of the year. So I think the ministerials are really important in signifying that very high level commitment across all of our economies to be able to advance these specific sectoral objectives leading up to the leaders meeting at the end of the year.
So there's going to be a lot of visits, not only at the leaders meeting, but also ministers from the other 20 APEC economies really in and out of the United States throughout the year.
Definitely. And I think that the impact of that sort of multilateral engagement across a number of different agencies and minister, ministers from around the region is important. But I think also the fact that we're bringing them to different parts of the United States, and we can also showcase for our own, domestic constituents and the domestic economy, why this engagement with the Asia Pacific region really matters, particularly as we have these meetings in places like as diverse as Palm Springs and Detroit and Seattle.
Okay, maybe I can turn to Angie quickly. And Matt had mentioned the importance of the private sector and their input and their leadership in any APEC host year. For this year, your CEO will be leading this the ABAC, the advisory committee. What will be his priorities, and are they going to be in line with the priorities of the other business representatives from the other 20 economies?
Right. So let's take a step back and just to kind of unpack what the Business Advisory Council is. Amongst the 21 economies of the of APEC, the Advisory Council has 3 members in each economy, and I would think that in and of itself, the history of how the Advisory Council came about is that of driving innovation, because it didn't come with APEC when it was formed in 1989. It came later, in I think 6 years later in 1995, right, Monica? And so that story is that because the importance of the voice of the private sector. The leaders recognize that the business community has something to say, and also that is an important part in driving development and growth in the region. And so that's when it formalized into this feedback loop into one body, which is the Business Advisory Council of APAC, and it's called ABAC. And it wouldn't be a government-related body without an acronym. So ABAC, as is known now, is comprises of 3 members from each economy, and they're business leaders that have.
And who appoints them?
So the leaders, which we call leaders, but presidents of the economies, prime ministers, chief executives of economy like Hong Kong. And so these members all together meet a couple of times a year, 4 times a year to be exact, and in person. And then there are virtual meetings throughout the year. There are working groups and task force that work to align the agenda with what Matt has talked about. And so resilient, sustainable future is a theme that APAC has our USA host year has created. And so when ABAC, the Business Advisory Council, reviews the US government's agenda for this whole APAC year, we're also trying to be mindful that we are complementing the government's agenda and the economy's goals and their objectives. So to work in alignment with that agenda, we have come up with three main themes that would be equity, sustainability, and opportunity. And in each of those areas, we're charting a way to operate in a way that is also aligned with not just the U.S. government, but the existing practice within the different economies that have worked. The Putrajaya, for example, vision. And let me just say to the Thai ambassador that, again, Thailand has done a great job, not just hosting a APAC for the leaders meeting, but they were also hosts for the Business Advisory Council meetings all through the year. And so they've driven that agenda in 2022. And now this new Advisory Council host year under the leadership of Dominic as chair of the council is going to chart through those 3 areas. Again, equity, sustainability, opportunity. And there are 3 working groups that are working on economic integration, that are working on digitalization, innovation, as well as sustainability, sustainable growth. And in each of those, we are mindful that we are meeting APAC where the APAC economies, the agenda, as well as what the existing economies have in terms of their resources, their capabilities. How can they also take ownership in advancing those goals, and idea of expanding opportunity so that we are increasing inclusion, broadening economic empowerment for women and indigenous people. That's important. And to build on the Bangkok goals of the green agenda, sustainability would be one area that we're focusing on all throughout with financial services and inclusion as a driver to cut across all 3 working groups. And so in a Q&A, we can delve a little more deeply. Again, the work of the working groups and task force is in the proposal stage, and we're finalizing, endorsing that final agenda next month in New Zealand in our first meeting of the Advisory Council. So a lot of what that is going to be done during our host year will be set in that meeting. So we're excited about working with Matt. That he's very humble. He's still smiling, not just as a career diplomat, and he really has been so invested, and his institutional knowledge into APEC has been helpful. And of course, Monica is really the voice and ambassador here of APEC since it's forming. They are the not so secret sauce of the success of the host year. So.
Thank you.
Very gracious
Monica,
of you.
let me turn to you then on this whole theme of inclusion, because APEC has been pretty successful in working closely with business through the years. But, part of the Biden administration's overall policy on trade, it's a worker-centered trade policy. They talk about making foreign policy work for the middle class. There's a lot of talk about women's empowerment. I mean, how can APEC kind of update itself and really create a more inclusive framework that invites voices beyond business?
Well, first, thank you. And thank the Asia Society for co-hosting this program. We've been doing this program, the National Center for APEC, with the Asia Society for a very long time. For those with long memories, since Nick Platt was president of the society, he would go to APEC meetings at the end of the year, and then he would come back and we'd do this meeting in New York to sort of recap what had happened. And so we're very glad to be back, glad to see people in person again. So after a hiatus here from COVID, and the post-COVID world of APEC, I think is something that, as the ambassador said, looking at the world through a post-COVID lens, I think has impacted the work that we've done on inclusion. And I think that, so for example, the ABAC did a big report on, through looking through a post-COVID lens at the new small and medium enterprise economy, and how has that changed the way small and medium enterprises are seen and how they operate, and how they have they taken maybe jumps forward? Have there been silver linings that they've found? But also, how have we identified that things like disruptions like the COVID pandemic have shown us that inequalities or disruptions have been harder on communities like women, communities like communities that have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. It's shown us, it's brought those things into greater relief that we can see it more clearly. So I think that it's given us new targets to sort of focus on how we can bring about more equity, more inclusion, more opportunity to some of those traditionally underrepresented populations in economic opportunity. One of the things that I think is interesting about APEC and the examples of women's inclusion, women's empowerment, and the examples of sustainability and climate change are both good examples. There were times in my memory of APEC, and I've been doing it a really long time, as has been mentioned a couple of times, feeling very old this morning, but that you would never mention it. I mean, that people would say, oh, women's stuff, you don't want to talk about that in APEC. That's not an appropriate topic for APEC. And it's like water against a stone. People kept bringing it up over and over again. And finally, they're like, oh, everybody starts embracing it as a topic and saying that this is really of central importance. We used to have ABAC meetings, and the 6 or 7 women ABAC members would get together and have lunch. And we'd call that the ABAC Women's Caucus. Well, suddenly then it's all 66 of the ABAC members that are sitting together at luncheon and having guest speakers, and the men and women. And then you have the ministers and leaders having a luncheon with the ABAC members talking about women's economic empowerment. And then all of Secretary Clinton convenes in San Francisco, the big women's empowerment forum event. And now it's a regular annual event, and we'll have the 10th anniversary of it in Seattle in August. And so there's things like that. Climate change was the same thing. People said that's not an appropriate issue for APEC. APEC's an economic forum. You just don't discuss that here. There are other international bodies that discuss that. We're not interested in that here. And now everybody says, of course, that's an economic issue. Of course, that's an issue that APEC should be discussing. These economies are touched by this in every possible way. We want to be talking about it here. So I think that's one of the ways that APEC, it may take some time, but again, like water against a stone, they will make an impact. And I think that's one of the ways, and I don't want to be too long-winded here, but that especially it's important that the U.S. hosts for our own reasons, that we want to take the leadership role and do the things that are our priorities. But also what I've noticed is that our partners in APEC look very much forward to the years when the U.S. hosts, because they want to see us take that leadership role. They want to see us active and engaged, and sometimes welcome us pushing the envelope sometimes to make APEC. Sometimes they're not comfortable with the ways we want to make APEC stronger, but sometimes
they don't show it.
Sometimes they don't show it, but I think I've heard privately, just people, especially back when about a year and a half ago, there was a lot of question as to whether or not we would be hosting. A lot of the economies would come and say, yes, we'd really like to see you do this. What can we do to help make this happen? And from the private sector side, there wasn't a lot, because it was very much a government kind of decision, but they really welcome it. And I think it's an important thing for us to be doing.
Okay, Matt. So we've heard a lot of words in terms of our objectives for the year: sustainability, resiliency, inclusiveness, opportunity. What does that mean in terms of delivering like practical outcomes for APEC? What do we want to achieve?
So I think that one of the big challenges with APEC, and this is true any year, particularly at the start of the year, is we have, you kind of think about it in several different levels. There's the high level theme and priorities. Then you can go very quickly down into the minutia of what our working level experts are focused on, in the digital economy group on cross-border privacy rules, or on the energy working group on specific renewable energy targets, or in the the health working group on telehealth solutions, or things of this nature. And then there's sort of what we talked about with the ministerial meetings, where I think as we head into our host year, it's very clear that all of our departments and agencies want to want to focus on sustainability and inclusivity. That's like a common thread that runs through all of those ministerials. And so the transportation ministerial wants to focus on, EV transportation. The trade ministerial is looking at sustainable and inclusive trade. The disaster resilience ministerial looking very much at responses to, climate resilience, but also pandemic response. Women in Economy Forum, SME ministerial, obviously looking at a lot of the inclusivity issues and how all of this pulls together. So, all of that to say that I think we are still in that stage at the very beginning of our year of working with other economies to figure out, okay, where are the 3 or 4 places where we can really, drive forward to have, a tangible, sustainable, agenda on sustainability and inclusivity. I think that'll be very important. As Monica was just saying, this is something that everybody's talking about in APEC right now. That wasn't necessarily the case 10 or 12 years ago on some of these topics. So what can we do there? How can we put our economic, growth in the region on a stronger footing through an emphasis there? I think another big point where there's a focus of a lot of APEC economies is on the digital economy. And, APEC has a lot of, again, strong, working level groups where, what are the things that we can do to strengthen the digital economy across a number of different areas. But APEC also has a very wide range of members across the region and that have different views on the digital economy. So how can we find that happy medium where we can drive forward, an initiative on the digital economy? And so I think we're still in that phase of getting to the 2 or 3, things that we want to make sure that we can announce at the end of the year. I do think it's a really unique opportunity for us to lead in the region and to work very closely with all of our partners, because I think that just based on this first year that I've been in this role, there is certainly there's a lot more agreement than there is disagreement on the need to really address a lot of the challenges we're facing comprehensively. Again, given this moment that we're in, and so I think we're going to drill down on the sustainability inclusivity piece. We're going to drill down on the digital piece. And I think, we have a really good opportunity to to come up with some more specifics as we go.
So you mentioned the members, and one of the most, the second largest economy is also a member of APEC, China. In the past few years, we've been at loggerheads with China in APEC on a number of issues, including just finalizing a draft statement. You mentioned digital, I think, is an area where you kind of see things differently. But do you see opportunities where we can work with China this year? I mean, presumably Xi Jinping will be coming to the November leaders meeting, and maybe he will have a stake in this meeting, in his trip here being successful and being able to point to some issues where we work together. But is that feasible? Are there areas where you think we can work together?
I think there are. And I think that, I spent a lot of my career in China. I've been posted there 3 times. And, I think what we know from, various times in history when we've been working with China is that, a lot of the direction comes from, the top down on where the opportunities are. I would like to think that President Biden's meeting with President Xi on the margins of the G20 in November, opened up an opportunity for us to do some things together. And I think at my level, at the senior official level in APEC, I talk to my senior official counterpart from China all the time. And it's one of those places where I think institutionally that's baked in, is that you're going to be talking to all of your counterparts. And I think that's one of the real strengths of APEC, is that's there. And so, I had a bilateral meeting with her in November in Bangkok. I had another bilateral meeting with her at the informal senior officials meeting in Honolulu. And we've been talking about, okay, what are the ways in which we can really focus on the C in APEC, the cooperation piece, together as we go into our year, and how can we test the proposition that there are things that the United States and China can do. I think it's really important not just for us to do that for our own relationship with China and for getting stuff done in APEC, but it's also really important because of the signal that sends to the rest of the region, right? That APEC is not just going to be a place where the US and China are at loggerheads all the time, and all of our partners in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and other places just are kind of caught in the middle. We want it to be a place where we are being an incubator for new ideas, where we are getting things done. And so I think to do that, we need to be very intentional about trying to work and cooperate with China as we go through the year.
Do any of the issue areas strike you as areas that are ready for cooperation? Like food security comes to my mind, where we both share concerns about food security and the implications for the rest of the world.
Sure. And just sustainability more broadly. I think there's a lot, I said a minute ago, I was struck coming back to APEC, how much of the discussion was about sustainability and climate and these kinds of issues. I could add to that I was even more struck by how much the Chinese delegation was talking about those issues as something that they wanted to work on. So I definitely see opportunities there. And, there are different, projects that economies can fund, through APEC. And so, we're working with China on a couple of possibilities, there. And so I think sustainability is definitely a big one. But I think as we went through the year in Thailand, I would say there's a lot of areas, you mentioned food security, where there's actually, more that we have in common that we have, different. I think that one thing we will have to do is that there are also a number of process issues in APEC that we will need to come eye to eye, as you will well remember, come eye to eye with China on, so that we can sort of get those things behind us and move forward. Everything, administrative issues, budget issues, what to put in a final document, what not to put in, a lot of minutia that we need to work through. But I think generally and on substance, I think there are a number of different things where we can work with China. So we'll try to make that happen as we go through the year.
If I could build on that from the private sector side, Wendy, I found it really notable that after President Biden's meeting with President Xi in Bali, that we had from the private sector side in APEC outreach from the Chinese delegations and several high-level folks that wanted to meet with us and talk about things that maybe we could work on next year, places we could cooperate. And as Angie mentioned, one of the ABAC working groups is on sustainability, and that's chaired by the Chinese ABAC member, Frank Ning, who's a very senior figure from China. And he's led that sustainability working group for a long time. And I think that's been one of the really cool things about, Dominic Ng has only been an ABAC member since April, but he's been named the chair of ABAC for next year. And that's one of the things his leadership has been very important on. He's been a leader in the Asia Pacific American community for a very long time. And that's just one of the pieces of outreach that he's been doing that's been very effective, I think, in the ABAC as well.
And I would agree, Monica, that Dominic, while I was executive director of the Committee 100, he was our chairman and has worked very closely with groups like Asia Society to actively engage the U.S.-China dialogue. And in the years since, here at the bank, at East West Bank, our footprint is in China and has been active in promoting that engagement. And so the type of leadership that he is bringing into ABAC is that other members of the advisory council really do work very well with him and look up to him, call on him in private as well for his advice, for his insights. And I think those camaraderie, those business personal relationships that are fomented now are somewhat under the radar. And eventually I see that as growing and turning into a flywheel effect for the U.S.-China dynamics. And it's the best way for public diplomacy to work when you have these force multipliers happening, when everyone is reciprocating and is in dialogue, finding common ground, when they would work on these cooperation activities together.
I'm going to ask one more question, then turn it open to the audience. So if you all have any questions, start thinking about them. Matt, for you. So I think Monica touched upon this, that APEC is a very important initiative for the United States to show its economic engagement and commitment to the Indo-Pacific region. In addition, the United States is pursuing the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is not a trade agreement, but more a broader economic agreement, working with a group of Indo-Pacific partners, not identical to the ones in APEC, but definitely overlapping membership. So we've got APEC and IPEF going on this year. Meanwhile, the rest of Asia, including China, is moving ahead, implementing trade agreements, updating trade agreements, forging new trade agreements. Some people think we're falling behind. In a recent Asia Society paper, we put on the table the prospect of starting a conversation about the United States rejoining TPP. And so I guess my question for you is, when you look at APEC and IPEF together, do you consider this to be a robust agenda, or do you think we need to be doing more in the region on the economic front, given the importance Asian countries put on the economic aspect of our relationship?
Yeah, I think the administration is really doing a lot on the economic engagement side with the region. The president launched the Indo-Pacific strategy, which has a whole economic prosperity pillar there. And within that pillar, you have, hosting APEC, you have launching the IPEF negotiations. We've upgraded some of our economic engagements bilaterally in the region, most notably with Japan, where we now have a Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce-led dialogue. We have now added a lot of economic work streams to our engagements with the Quad, with India, Japan, and Australia. There's been a big focus in the administration on infrastructure development in the region. And so I think that as you look at all of these various, mechanisms, a lot of the same goals are there across the board. For example, if you take the four IPEF objectives, the trade and digital, supply chains, decarbonization, and also anti-corruption. I mean, those are areas, for example, that we worked with or worked on in APEC for a very long time. And those are also, I think, consistent across some of the other engagements that we're doing. And we're talking, bilaterally with partners like Korea and Taiwan about supply chains, for example. And so I think that there's a lot there on the economic engagement front. I think the key for us is just to keep, we have to keep building that out, because for our partners in the region, this really matters, the economic engagement with the United States, and it matters for our economy. When we think about, the APEC members just by themselves, they're roughly half of global trade. They're about 60% of our U.S. exports go to APEC economies, and 7 of our 10 top export destinations. And when you think about just the Indo-Pacific, more broadly, it ends up being about $2 trillion in bilateral trade, and another $1 trillion in investment. And so it's a major part of our economic growth, and it's also our active participation is very important, to the region. So we want to keep building it out. I know that there's always the questions about, does the United States have an economic agenda with the Indo-Pacific and with the Asia-Pacific? I would say that based on how, I work on APEC, and our office does regional economic policy. Based on how busy our office is, it feels like we are building a really positive and affirmative economic agenda with the region, but we need to keep working on it.
Okay, questions from the audience. If you can identify yourself, if you want to ask a question.
No. Thank you very much. My name is Wilson from New York City. I was going to ask you a question about Trump, but I don't want to ruin your day. So I have a question about Russia. I know Russia is a member of the APEC, and how is that going? And number two, a few months ago, I listened to a Japanese official talking about their new Economic Security Act that came up last year, which tries to decouple from mostly China in terms of supply chain. And how is that working within APEC? Because they're trying to take away manufacturing and supply chain from China to other nations around them, like probably Vietnam and Taiwan and stuff. So what kind of conflict do you see in the future? Thank you.
We take another question too, and then we'll turn it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Monica He with a company called Organon. It's a women's health company. And just wanted to thank the Asia Society, and also thank you for the speakers for this really interesting discussion. My question has to do with, Wendy, you in your opening mentioned these kind of macroeconomic headwinds that kind of certainly kind of creates a very interesting and challenging context that, leading into the U.S. host year. You mentioned, energy crisis, potential economic recession, inflation, and then geopolitics.
Very uplifting, right?
But I mean, so do you see them as more of a contextual factor for the U.S. host year, and I'm curious if the panelists see, are there opportunities? Do they kind of shape how the U.S. and the member economies of APEC think about what the outcomes and the principles that, that they want to achieve into this year? So thank you very much.
Okay, so we've got a number of questions, including the role of Russia in APEC and what that means for our host year. A question on Japan's economic security agenda and the broader issue of shifting supply chains in the region. And then what are these economic headwinds? What does that do for our APEC agenda? So who wants to take one or two of them or none of them?
No, I'm happy to work.
I nominate Matt.
Happy to work through them. First of all, thank you, sir, for asking the question about Russia, which was, a big topic in this last year. The ambassador sort of referenced it indirectly when he talked about geopolitical tensions. But we were actually in a virtual senior officials meeting in February at the same time that Russia was invading Ukraine. So we had to quickly, sort of adapt to how we were going to address that situation throughout our APEC host year. At the beginning of the year, there was a little bit of a schism between some economies who said, this is a very important thing to talk about in APEC because of the impact it has on the regional economy, the impact it has on inflation, the impact it has on energy prices, the impact on food security, just to name a few. There were some other economies that said, well, APEC's tradition is that we don't raise quote unquote political issues in APEC, and Russia is a member, so we really shouldn't, bring those things up. What happened throughout the year is every single time we had a ministerial meeting, this problem resurfaced, because what APEC likes to do is when you have a ministerial meeting, you release a statement at the end, which in APEC tradition should be a consensus statement. But basically what happened was in all of the ministerials that were held in May and August, we couldn't reach a consensus statement because some economies, including the United States, wanted to introduce language in the statement on, the impact of the Russia war in Ukraine on the regional economy for whatever that topic was, whether it was trade or food security or, whatever the topic of the ministerial was. And so, and then Russia, of course, as a member of APEC would block that. And so we didn't have any consensus statements throughout the year. We had only, chair statements that Thailand released. So we got a lot of work done still, and all the rest of the substance was taken care of, but it became, again, a little bit of a conflict within APEC on how are we going to deal with this. By the end of the year, that had changed, that had shifted, I think in large part because as the war has lingered on, those economic impacts have become more apparent, particularly for some of the poorer economies in APEC. And so by the time we got to the leaders meeting, there was a lot more momentum to try to reach some consensus language around the impact of Russia's invasion. Then the G20 was able to get some consensus language a few days before APEC in Indonesia. And then basically we borrowed that same language and put it into the leaders and ministerial document in Bangkok. And so, I think that this is still a point of tension within the organization, but it's still going to have to be a continued discussion and continued engagement on it for as long as the war unfortunately goes on, because it does have a major impact on the economics of the region, not to mention the humanitarian disaster that's happening in Ukraine. So it's a great question and something we should have raised earlier. I think on your question about economic security and Japan, I think that every single economy in the region is trying to figure out how do you do both the promote and protect side with your economy. How do you promote good economic ties while also protecting your key, your intellectual property, your technology, and all of those things. And certainly the COVID pandemic has really sort of accelerated some of the questioning that I think a lot of economies have done, have had to ask themselves about how to deal with China and how to deal with supply chains in China. And so, Japan has taken, some action, as you said, with a new economic security law. I know, Korea is also very focused on economic security related to China. At the same time, businesses are making their own decisions about whether to stay in China, whether to leave China for another market. And so in the APEC context, I think we end up with a conversation about supply chain resiliency, because that is a concern to all 21 of the members, including China. But we don't necessarily in APEC meetings get into the specifics of companies leaving China, for various reasons, whether that's an economic security reason or, just the prospects for that company might see for its own economic growth by continuing to be in China. So we still address supply chains, but we have to do it in a way that's sensitive to the fact that China is one of our members. But we have lots of other mechanisms with Korea, with Japan, to talk through some of these economic security priorities. Our Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy and Environment, Jose Fernandez, is in Korea and Japan this week, and this is one of the topics that he's talking about is economic security. So there are a lot of other mechanisms by which we're also, I guess I would say, comparing notes with those economies and trying to move forward.
And Monica, in response to your question, I would, my perspective is, given all these headwinds, and when you look at the issues of concern for APEC economies, that it really is important in the host year to address some of these challenges for an organization like APEC to remain relevant. I give kudos to the Thai ambassador. He announced an initiative that they had put into place called Safe Passage, which had a lot to do with responding to COVID and the need to keep people and keep goods and all of that moving. So I think it's important for APEC to be credible and relevant to deliver results, with respect to issues like food security, like energy, like sustainability and climate change. And I assume that's driving the agenda.
Well, in the APEC meetings, every meeting starts with this terribly depressing moment when the local host, every APEC meeting takes place in a different economy. Everyone takes turns hosting it, except for the fourth one every year, which is in the host economy. But so the local host always brings in a local economist to give you their economic outlook. And it's always depressing, but they'll come in and give you this, sort of dour economic outlook challenge. And so the last several have been, rather dark. Things are very challenging out there. And I liked and I wrote down what Matt said that Secretary Blinken had said about meeting the moment. I mean, APEC has to meet this moment, and the moment may not be pretty. I remember in various years, APEC has had different global impacts from, East Timor to, there's just different things going on in the world all the time. And APEC seems to find itself impacted by them. And so I think it always has to meet that moment, and it will certainly have to this year. And all these things like food security and the digital transformation for SMEs and things are things that it's been working on for a long time. But this moment is really important that those things that there's been a runway, because it now is really a time on health where APEC's been working on things for such a long time, but right now those things become even more important than they have been. So it's been critical that there's been these conversations and this cooperation that's been building the infrastructure for what we need to do now on the networking.
Well, I would also want to add that it's no coincidence that we're hosting the last meeting in San Francisco. So the APEC will be meeting, the first meeting in New Zealand, the second meeting would be in Brunei, and third meeting would be in the Philippines, and culminating in the last meeting in San Francisco. And it's wonderful that we can bring the global leaders in technology to really add to the solution architecture of how digital grow, how to promote the benefits of digital growth. How are we looking at digital identification, cybersecurity? How are we promoting cross-border data flows within the region and also much larger in the world? And so those are areas that I think give members like Dominic and his peers and APEC the enthusiasm and also somewhat optimism that in this host year, we can have that opportunity to address some of these challenges.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah English with Citi. As I'm thinking through and hearing you talk about, keeping APEC relevant and ensuring its longevity, I wonder, has there any thought being given to maybe a fellowship program that could sort of bring in private sector, academia, government, where, it's APEC is an interesting model addressing all these issues. I wonder though, bringing in sort of those sectors together and sort of following the host countries throughout the different years and hosting, so you could kind of follow and track some of these initiatives and ensure their longevity. We'd love to hear the speaker's thoughts on that.
Other questions? Danny
It's going to be a hard
from the Asia Society.
I'm
Alex?
Danny Russell. I look for Wendy Cutler.
I work for you.
Well, thanks to all of the speakers. I'm doing a lot of work at the Asia Society on development, and particularly what the United States, what China, what Japan is doing in Southeast Asia and other parts of the APEC sphere. You've talked about what ABAC is doing, and Angelica talked also about the private sector, but I'm interested in what involvement there may be with either the international development banks and institutions that work on these issues of sustainability, food security, public health, and so on, or else some of the big foundations and NGOs that play an important role. How do they dock with the different components of APEC?
Who'd like to take those?
I want to just be sure that we connect with Sarah on what the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council is, which is a tripartite entity which actually predates APEC, and it called for APEC's creation way back when. But it is government, private sector, and well, then in the U.S. case, it's sort of former government officials in their non-government capacities, but in the other economies, and it even has some non-APEC economies in it. But the idea of, it doesn't actually have fellowships, but that's an interesting thing to put on that agenda. And it also has academics throughout. And there is a very active APEC studies network as well. And I think we can, Alex in our office is the executive director of USPEC. And we should probably think about getting something like that on their agenda, because it does track. I mean, they're doing a lot of work right now on supply chain resilience and decarbonization of supply chains, and some other projects that tie in with different APEC work and can do that kind of that sort of work. And they have partners in other APEC economies. And Richard Cantor from Moody's is actually the co-chair internationally of PEC. So I think we have the right places to plant that idea. So that's a good one. And Danny, you know, the folks from the World Bank and the IFC Finance Corporation, International Finance Corporation, do participate in something that ABAC helped launch with the finance ministers process called the Asia Pacific, APFF, Asia Pacific Finance Forum, Financial Forum. And they have, it's like 5 different work streams, and some of them are working on different areas, and I can connect you with the fellow that knows what all those are and all the nitty gritty. They have constant meetings, constant dialogues with regulators and different volunteers, and city is actually involved in that, in some of those work streams. It's very much private sector, public sector partnerships in developing those things, but the international development banks and institutions are involved in those. I don't know how much foundations are involved in them. But there's a lot going on there, and I'll try to figure out how to connect you, because it's good that you're diving into those, because I don't understand what they're all doing, but there's a lot going on. You probably know more than I.
Yeah, I think different organizations pop up at different times of the year too. So I know that, the Asia Foundation does a lot with youth engagement, particularly on technology. They have an app challenge, they have a digital economy challenge throughout the year. They partner with Google on that, which has been, last year was really interesting. It was about designing food security solutions in developing economies. Was the challenge. And so they came up with some pretty creative things from young innovators from around the region, which was fantastic. I think that you see a lot of the different multilateral development banks and the World Bank and the IMF and others intersecting at various times throughout the year through the finance ministers process, or through, even at the leaders meeting, where the World Bank and the IMF were. And then, all of the different development agencies are somehow involved in, different economies. So for us, we work with both USAID and FEMA very directly throughout the year. USAID manages a technical capacity project called US SEGA, where we work with some of the developing economies in APEC on various capacity building initiatives. One example of that is that Peru is getting ready to host APEC in 2024. So we work with them, through some of that preparation. But I think the other thing that's really important here that I've definitely seen for some of our developing economies in the region is I was really struck the first time I had a bilateral meeting with my Papua New Guinea counterpart, and they talked about how critical the development agenda is to them, and that one of the best ways that APEC can contribute to that is by really focusing in on some of the key areas of good governance and some of the initiatives that we talk about on anti-corruption and other things, so that they have kind of a roadmap, as it were, that they can then take back to their home economy. And where they get frustrated, interestingly, with APEC is when we're not specific enough, or we're not as focused on metrics as we should be, or we get drowned in process when it comes to some of the expert level meetings, because what they're asking for is how can you show us what the right things to do are, and that we can take that back to our home economy, which I also think thought was a really interesting kind of mandate for us to remember, is that if we're fumbling and bumbling in APEC for the United States, not a huge impact, but for Papua New Guinea or some of the developing economies in that region, it is a huge impact. They really need the outcomes to really drive their processes at home as well on the development side.
New membership. So if my math is correct, it's been about 20 years since APEC has let any new members in. There's kind of been a moratorium on new membership. 21 economies currently are part of APEC. The president of the Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute, Kevin Rudd, wrote a paper about 6 years ago trying to make the case for India, the importance of India joining APEC. Are we going to have new membership on our agenda this year, particularly given an increasing close cooperation between the United States and India in a number of areas?
So it's actually 25 years. 1998 was the last time we added new members. And so I think that we're in a place in APEC, again, coming out of the COVID pandemic with some of the challenges with Russia that the gentleman in the back talked about. With all of that and looking at the 21 member economies being roughly half of global trade, I think we're in a good place in terms of the membership size. But there are opportunities in your host year to bring in other economies for parts of the discussions and to really see if there are ways to collaborate. I know in the Thailand host year, for example, at the end of the year, they also invited leaders from France, Cambodia, and Saudi Arabia to participate in Leaders Week. So there are those kinds of opportunities. And then with meetings throughout the year, with APEC being 10 ministerials and 4 senior officials meeting clusters and close to 300 working group meetings throughout the year, there are definitely opportunities to do outreach with other economies. APEC, unlike the OECD, doesn't have like a set process for how you would add new members, and they also they don't have any individual economies as official observers for a whole year. So I think that's something that we would need to look at on an ad hoc basis in terms of who we're inviting and what we're inviting them to. But certainly there are lots of opportunities, I think, around our region to enhance engagement between APEC and economies like India. We're also engaging Fiji in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework discussions. There are Latin American economies that are also OECD members that are certainly have expressed interest in the past. So, I don't think adding new members necessarily is on the agenda, but there's certainly opportunities for enhanced outreach.
Just final question then. What does success look like next November? Can each of you touch upon that quickly? What would, in your view, how could we say that the United States host year was a success because we achieved what? Angie.
I would say most definitely some concrete outcomes, some specific deliverables that we could chart. And that's what really the business community is very good at. And the leaders on the APEC are in concurrence that we need to this host year that we can come together and produce something that is sustainable, enduring, and that we can remember. In past years, been the APEC business travel card, and the fact that President Clinton upgraded the meeting to leaders level from ministerials. So some level of outcomes like that, and also for APEC, Dominic's priority, as he has articulated with his peers on APEC, is that we'll generate and work on a work plan that would maximize and tap the expertise and engagement of each one of this APEC member. And that would be a critically success, I think, for each one of those member economy to come in and say, we had a stake in it, and we're responsible for those outcomes.
Monica.
A smiling Matt Murray and a smiling President Biden. No, I think one of the things I would love to see in San Francisco is just a really something that we had in after 2011 was through, that people would come out of the meetings in San Francisco and say, just, wow, that was a really robust and different and dynamic exchange with the private sector at APEC and at the CEO Summit. That's the element, the event that's at the leaders meeting. But to say that we really found a different way to engage, or that it was just unique in some way. So we'll figure out how. But
and Matt, final word.
Yeah, so we just had our informal senior officials meeting in Honolulu, and we definitely were very intentional in the way we structured it. And a couple things out of that get me thinking about the answer to this question. The one is, I was really heartened that when a lot of our counterparts were leaving, they said, "Wow, that was really inspiring." The meeting itself was an inspiring agenda. You were showing, the best, that the United States has to offer, the contributions the U.S. can make to the global economy and the region's economy. And I think if we can continue along that trajectory, so by the end of our year, our counterparts around the region are saying, "Well, that was really inspiring," and we know the United States wants to be engaged in this region and, is showing leadership in this way. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is, to Angie's point as well, that we also, in our meeting in Honolulu, we had a panel discussion on the Women in Economy agenda that the United States launched in 2011 in our host year. We also had a panel discussion on the green growth agenda that the United States launched in 2011 in our host year. So, it would be great if we were able to, have those kinds of specific outcomes and deliverables that, 11, 12, 13 years from now, the discussion is around what we launched in our 2023 host year. Mm-hmm. Because, this is a really great opportunity to set an agenda, a positive, future-oriented agenda on how the United States can make a positive contribution in the region, and what that engagement with the region means for our economy here at home.
Great optimistic note. I love concluding events with an upbeat conclusion. So please join me in thanking Matt, Monica, and Angie for taking the time, and thank you for coming out this morning.
Thank you.